Hi, my name is Quentin Palfrey. I'm the president of the International Digital Accountability Council. And this presentation is in connection with the COVID-19 mobile app accountability project, which is data for policy submission number 58. So first about the IDAC. The IDAC is a new international nonprofit watchdog that was incubated within the Future of Privacy Forum until this April, and then launched as a separate nonprofit organization. And our mission is to improve global digital accountability through monitoring, investigation, and education. Our first major study was to look at a number of the apps that were being developed by governments and their partners in order to contain the coronavirus pandemic. So we looked at 108 apps across 41 countries that were available on the Google Play Store. And we looked at 4 categories of apps. So we were interested in contact tracing apps that are often used in order to contain the spread of the virus. We looked also at telemedicine apps that patients use to engage with healthcare providers. We looked at symptom trackers as people were trying to determine whether they're infected with the virus. And we also looked at quarantine enforcement apps that governments were using to ensure that citizens were complying with rules relating to the pandemic. We looked at a series of different pieces of these apps. As my colleague Will Manji from our technical team and from Good Research, our partners, will explain in a moment, we did a combination of static and dynamic analysis on these 108 apps. And at the top level, we understood that these governments and their partners were rolling out these apps very quickly under extreme time pressure and in connection with a really important public policy objective. And so we took that into account. We also were very focused on trying to increase the trustworthiness of this environment because trust is such an important component of compliance with these apps, and they need broad adoption in order to work. So we're very pleased on the whole that governments and their partners, the private sector app developers, often were taking very good measures to ensure privacy and security. And we, for the most part, did not see egregious or malicious conduct. That said, we did find 4 categories of concerns. One category related to what we call transparency. So these were either failure to have a privacy policy or failure to have a privacy policy that accurately reflected the conduct that we were seeing. We also had some concerns about the integration of software development kits, also called SDKs. In some contexts, we were concerned that this code was being used in a way that created risks for users and didn't have an obvious benefit in terms of the functionality that a user would reasonably expect from the apps. We did have some concerns about security practices, and in particular encryption in transit and at rest. And we had some concerns about requests for permissions. So my colleagues are going to go into a little bit more detail. I have 2 colleagues who are working with us on this presentation. My colleague Will Manji will explain some of the technical aspects of our presentation. And then my colleague Lena Rowley will walk through some of the specific findings. Will, if you could take it from here.
Thank you, Quentin. So as Quentin said, we have a suite of tests that could be classified as both dynamic and static. The static tests are usually just looking at code and trying to analyze what potential things could happen from that code. This is the code from the apps or additional assets that could come from just using the app. And the dynamic tests are basically, we use a phone, a normal phone, in a controlled environment, and we have sets of sensors that tell us what is happening underneath the phone, what is happening in the phone, and what transmissions are being sent. With these, we're looking at what is actually happening. So the pros and cons of the dynamic and the static kind of like merge each other well, or merge with each other well. With the dynamic, we see what actually happens. With the static, they give us sometimes the possibilities of what could happen that sometimes the dynamic we could miss with the dynamic tests. The tests that we're looking at reveal what types of personal information are being collected, things like name, things like email, but sometimes it could be more contextual information, the name of your Wi-Fi, the hardware identifier of your Wi-Fi, could be identification information about your phone, like the IMEI or what carrier you use. And it could, in some cases, it can be additional information about your house, about your geolocation, about other devices on your Wi-Fi that are connected. We're interested in seeing not just what data is being collected, but who that data is being sent to. In some cases, we classify that as first parties or third parties, whether they're like analytic services or just other entities that might have gained access to that data. It's important for us also to see what types of permissions the apps are requesting, not just because the apps could access that information, but sometimes because of, with the fourth point, we talk about the SDKs. SDKs are software that can be integrated into an app for multiple reasons. It could be just layout or just flipping the images upside down or small things like that. But it's usually also utilized for integrating services. For example, I have a geolocation and I want to send back to the user restaurants nearby or the closest grocery shop. That could be done through a API by sending that geolocation. And usually these services, these maybe Foursquare or Google Maps, have SDKs so that a developer can include that into the phone more easily and make use of these services. The important thing about the permissions is that sometimes these permissions are also available for these SDKs. So there's like little third parties that are within the app that sometimes we as users don't see. If I downloaded the Candy Crush app, I only think that my data is going to Candy Crush, but maybe there's other entities that are part in there through these SDKs. The more permissions that Candy Crush asks of me, the more permissions these third parties might have as well. And before we dive into the findings with Lena, I can just note to our methodology for finding these 108 apps that Quentin mentioned. So the Google Play Store started whitelisting apps pretty early on once a user was searching for coronavirus or COVID-19 or similar. But we tried to keep our universe of COVID apps as wide as possible by following media outlets and identifying similar apps by looking at recommended apps and things like that. So it's impossible to determine how many apps are in the universe, but we tried to get as much of them and of all of them that were available for us at that time. And now Lena, our chief of staff, is gonna guide us through the findings.
Great, thanks so much, Joel. So we have 4 major findings, as Quentin mentioned earlier. The first one was dealing with transparency. So in some instances, we found that these COVID-19 apps did not have a privacy policy posted at all, which actually is also a violation of Google developer policies. And in other instances, we found that their privacy policies were either vague or they were copied and pasted from other contexts, which is just not appropriate for a COVID-19 privacy policy. So it was interesting to see the range. And based on the different geolocations, we also noticed that privacy policies in the EU typically did a better job at disclosing their collection, retention, and sharing practices. The next finding had to do with these third-party software development kits or SDKs. We did see the presence of some SDKs that our team thought were inappropriate given that these were COVID-19 apps that were collecting very sensitive personal information such as health data or location information. So we saw the presence of some analytics and advertising SDKs, again, in a context that isn't really appropriate. So the concern here is that a lot of times these SDKs collect more information than users are aware of. And we were concerned that these SDKs might be leaking information to other third parties. The next finding was around security. And in some instances, we did see that apps were sending unencrypted transmissions as well as open-ended APIs, which is a big concern for us because this allows anybody that is eavesdropping into the communication to have access to what data is being sent. And this really exposes users to an array of cyber attacks. And again, just given the sensitive information, and given that a lot of times it was government partners that are deploying these apps, we expected a higher level of care here. And lastly, we found that roughly half of the apps that we tested requested permissions that have the potential to be invasive, and that exceeded the information that is necessary for the app to provide its services. So for example, a lot of apps were requesting the ability to read external storage or write external storage, which in some cases actually allows the app to access a user's shared files, which then allows the app to infer more personal information about the user, such as their location. So again, it was a concern for us because the users might be providing more information than they actually think that they are to the app. So our report went into some recommendations for each area of concern. And starting with transparency, we recommended that any app collecting this information should be very transparent about the information that they collect, who they share it with, and how long they intend to keep the information. Again, it's against best practices to copy and paste from other privacy policies or to be so vague that it's not helpful. In terms of security, this is very basic protocol, but we recommend to always send information using HTTPS or TLS protocol, just to ensure that the information is being safe and is encrypted both in transit and at rest. In terms of third-party SDKs, we recommend that developers really carefully review what SDKs they're using and understand the implications of using those SDKs. Ultimately, we recommend they should only include absolutely necessary SDKs for the app to function. Similarly, with the permissions, we recommended that app developers should only request permissions that are needed for the app's core functions and nothing beyond that. So the nice thing is that both before the report was released and immediately after, our team had the ability to work with numerous developers to address the concerns that we raised in the report. And we're pleased to announce that there actually were some significant outcomes that have arisen since. So a few examples, we did note that there were some apps that had no privacy policy posted, and we were able to work with a few developers to change that, and now apps have posted privacy policies since. There also was an instance where we worked with the developer to point out the inclusion of an SDK that we thought could be problematic, and they have now since retired using that SDK. And lastly, there was an instance where we saw an app sharing information with a third-party marketing group, which again, we thought was an inappropriate third party to be sharing this information with. And since then, the company has agreed to stop sharing information with that marketing group. So overall, we are very pleased with the impact our report has had. And I'm going to turn it back to Quentin now to discuss IDAC's next steps beyond this report.
Thanks so much, Lena, and thanks, Will. This is an incredibly dynamic environment. Governments and their partners are working feverishly to try to contain the pandemic and get economies reopened. And we are very focused on helping governments and their partners to ensure the trustworthiness of this ecosystem so that these measures, the public health and economic stimulus measures, can be successful. And we're very excited to be part of the Data for Policy Conference. We would love to collaborate with you as you move forward with these efforts. Additionally, there are a whole range of new tech tools that are being explored for work with businesses to facilitate travel, for distance learning, and for remote collaboration and working from home that are newly relevant because of the pandemic. And so IDAC's work has also focused on some of those additional tech tools and with a similar focus on trying to raise the bar on the practices within the developer ecosystem and to work collaboratively with developers, platforms, government agencies, and others to try to improve these practices in real time. Over time, we aim to raise the bar in terms of consumer protection, privacy, and data protection practices across the digital ecosystem. And we would love to see the IDAC be an important part of a larger effort that involves increasingly specific norm development, developer education, and of course our main focus on accountability. So we would love to collaborate with you and with others, and you can reach us through the International Digital Accountability Council. Our contact information is on the last slide. Thank you very much.